مساء الخير.
Good evening to all of you, our dear professors and our dear guests and colleagues and our dear students. My name is Nadia Sheikh. I'm the Deputy Dean of the University for Communication and Cultural Communication and Research. It's an honor and a pleasure to have you with us this evening. It's also an honor for NYU Abu Dhabi University to welcome you in this webinar, in this event where we will discuss the narratives of Moriscos' expulsion in Spanish and Arab thought. Since it was established in 2008, NYUAD has been keen on attracting experts and academicians and artists from all over the globe to attend its events and its programs and general programs. This evening, it's an honor to welcome Mr. Houssem Chachia, who will give us a lecture in which he will highlight and showcase some of his insights about the Spanish and Arab thought in terms of Moriscos and the expulsion. He is a Tunisian expert and a Tunisian professor. He obtained a PhD in history from the University of Tunis, of Tunisia. He has many publications about the developments in the Andalusia and Moroccan area and region. He has a manuscript about Nasr al-Din al-Qawm al-Kafirin manuscript, which was written by Ahmed al-Andalusi in 2015. He received the award of Ibn Battuta for the traveling literature given by a Swahili house in Abu Dhabi. It was issued recently for him a book that he issued about the Moriscan thought, which was published in Riyadh and Tamimi establishment in Tunisia. His intervention is part of a series of lectures about the history of Andalusia, and this lecture is the third one. The fourth lecture will be held on the 7th of March. There's a change. It's not a mistake. The lecture about the intellectual crossroads of Andalusia and how the Andalusi scholars shaped the world by Meritech Road will take place on the 7th of March and not the 8th of March. There's a change due to the fact that this is the International Women's Day and there's a big event on that. So would like to thank Dr. Houssem Chachia and would like to thank you for coming, and would like to thank all our guests for attending and for your keenness on attending this event. I would like to welcome all of you to NYU Abu Dhabi University and wish you a wonderful time. Dr. Chachia, please, the floor is yours. At the beginning, I would like to express my appreciation and gratitude to New York University Abu Dhabi for the kind invitation. I would like to thank Professor Nadia for her introduction. This work or research that I will highlight for you is part of a research project that I started back in 2018. I'm trying to look into the Moriscan history in the Arab and Spanish thought and intellect. This is the outcome of my work. This is the book that I issued recently. It is still, actually it was published by a publishing house. At the beginning, before I start, I would like to introduce the Moriscos to you briefly. The Moriscos are the Muslims who remained in their home cities in Spain. After the fall of Andalusia, they were forced to convert to Christianity as of 1502, and this process continued until the year 1526. Those are the people whom we call the Moriscos. The second element is, why are we focusing on the Spanish-Arab interactions on the Moriscan issue? I believe that this part of history is still problematic. Whether in Spain, as I will highlight later, and the major segment or the major part of my intervention will focus on this issue in Spain and also the Arab world. For instance, in Spain, up till now, they still celebrate the date where Granada fell into their hands. Every year, they revive the event itself. And every year on Twitter or Facebook, we will have the issue being highlighted and discussed from different angles. So all of this problematic and thorny presence of this type of history and this segment of history called upon me to study this topic. So studying how the Moriscos were highlighted and covered in Arab writing, it was not really the subject of major attention from Arab academicians, but the Spanish researchers looked into this topic, despite the fact that these actions were very important. However, the way of approaching the Spanish thought on the Moriscan issue was quite limited, whether in the time span or the topics covered. Mainly, we focus on the 16th and 17th century alone, and the 18th century is overlooked, as I will show later on. So this absence of research into this topic and shaping an image that will give us a clear view of what happened on the ground, and also the Arab perspective about the Moriscos, this is what really impelled me to conduct this research. My concept is about understanding the development of the Spanish intellect and thought in addressing Moriscos. This is something that can only be done in the long term. So since the period of time where the events themselves took place, I mean the historic event in reference to the 16th and the 17th century, and then we have the memory span, or the 17th and 18th century. So we have two time spans in this regard. Given many writings at the 16th and 17th century by Spanish researchers or the justification researchers. So I mean those historians try to justify what happened. So one of the leaders of those writings, we have the Pope of Chachia, Joan Ribera, and his colleague Khayi Bleda, in the books defending the creed and the identity of the Moriscos. So there have been a number of religious writings that preceded these dates, and from the titles of these writings we can understand how they want to justify what happened. For example, one of the topics, one of the books is titled "The Justified Expulsion of the Moriscos from Spain," and so on. So what we notice in those writings is the word using allegory and using symbolism to explain why this expulsion took place and why this expulsion was fair from the Spaniards' side, or the people in Spain's side. So the writers were focusing on obtaining examples from reality. So they said that when you have a serpent in the house, you have to expel it, or when you have cancer affecting one of your organs, it has to be amputated. So this is how they likened the Moriscos to cancer and to serpents. So those writers have been focusing on the Islamic origins of the Moriscos to justify why they were expelled. At the same period, at the end of the 16th century and the beginning of the 17th century, other Spanish writers embarked on an attempt to write about those events by from eyewitness testimonies. De Mezioga, who wrote a book about Granada's war, he talked about the civil war in Granada, and also Mamun Capital, and these are some of the titles of these books, because we have noticed that there is a great deal of similarities between the religious leaders and the religious people's writings and the researchers in Spain of that history. So there has been a marked difference between what the historians said and what the religious people said. What the historians did is that they were more bound to focusing on the facts, but the religious leaders focused on more the religious side and the emotional side. So the cultural aspects were different in different Castilla and different cities in Spain back then. So some historians were able to understand the complex nature of the situation, but this type of understanding was absent among the composers of songs and poems, who were completely antagonistic to the Moriscos and praising Philip III, including Gaspar Aguilar, who wrote a poem about the expulsion of Muslims from Spain by His Majesty Philip III, and in which he praised his actions. Moreover, most popular Spanish culture poems focus on hostility towards the Moriscos. And there weren't many complex artistic poems, but they focused on explaining a simplistic image of what took place. And it was basically quite hostile against the Moriscos. However, some of them rejected what happened and had some sort of compassion towards those Moriscos, because they said even if they were worthy of expulsion, the tragedy and its negative impact on thousands of people, including men, women, senior people, children, and so many people, really touched the spirit and the hearts of so many poets. And those poets could not really withhold the fact that they have to cover the tragedy that took place, even if they tried to use all the tools and the artistic and literary tools against the issue of celebrating the expulsion of those Moriscos. This was another trend that we witnessed in the golden era for the Spanish civilization, where we see some of those works of art showed some sort of compassion towards the Moriscos. One of the early novels that covered the Moriscos, we have the Matthew Alemann's novel in his novel Los Mandia Tarachi, and also Solik Dostin and Miguel de Cervantes, and other novels which belong to the so-called the paupers literature, which focused on the life of marginalized segments of the Spanish communities and talked about slaves and impoverished people and the Moriscos as well. Like any other novel, the presence of Moriscos varied extensively, but the main note here is that this presence was quite limited and marginal in nature. For instance, as highlighted by some researchers, the Moriscos' romantic novels were quite limited. They projected to a limited level the novels that glorified the enemy, the Moriscos, and put them forward as noble knights, even if they were enemies. However, the officials in the Spanish state back then rejected these works of art and theater, despite the presence of some Moriscos characters in the 15th century plays. However, the key features of those Moriscos in the Spanish theater go back to the 17th century, particularly in the works of Lope de Vega and the plays of Lope de Vega, and also in the works of Calderón de la Barca, who wrote a play written Love After Death, which was dedicated entirely to the Moriscos issue. On this graph, we can see the level of presence for the Moriscos and their attendance in most of the scenes of that play. However, playwriters in Spain obscured the Moriscos issue, not because they were not important to the Spanish people, nor the fact that they were really important, but quite the opposite. It is a very dramatic issue, or actually it's an over-dramatic issue. It's an issue that can only reflect the tragedy of the Morisco victims. It condemns by nature the society, the Spanish society that expelled them in such a tragic manner. So the Morisco's presence in the 17th century literature in Spain, researchers into the 18th century, now moving on to the 18th century, there is almost total absence of Morisco's issues and the role that the Spanish people handled this topic in the 18th century, because it is believed that the Spanish people believe that this is a chapter that they have concluded in their history after the end of the expulsion in the 15th century. However, the presence of the Moriscos in the Spanish community did not end with the end of the expulsion process in the year 1524. It continued until the first half of the 18th century. From this graph, we can see how the presence of Moriscos or the tribunals of the Granada Moriscos in the 18th century, how it evolved. Here we see a sharp rise between the year between the years 1730 and 1727, which coincides with Granada's tribunals. Granada's tribunals were the last window through which we can understand the situation of the Moriscos in Spain. Here we see the sentences given to the Moriscos compared to the sentences given to them in the 16th and 17th century. They were much lighter, as you can see, and much lighter sentences and much more lenient sentences. Also, painting among this group of the Moriscos, we have seen also a number of variation among those groups, including administrative people, religious leaders, and so on. There were a large number of women in the Moriscos community for a number of reasons that we may explain later on. So the Moriscos have continued and continue to exist in Spain in the 18th century. However, the Moriscos issues took a back seat since the second half of the 17th century. This means that it was a little bit forgotten. However, it continued in the 18th century about the expulsion of the Moriscos and its impact on the literature of Spain at different degrees. However, the publications associated with this event that go all the way back to the 17th century were published and republished. Here we see that we can see how the presence of Moriscos evolved in the library of the National Library of Spain. It's definitely the 16th century witnessed many writings, but also in the 19th centuries we had writings about the Moriscos. This is another graph that shows and stresses the same fact and the same concept. So the Moriscos in the 18th century were no longer a threat to the religious unity, or between two brackets, the national security of the Spanish state. They have become only part of a past event that is still living in the conscious and subconscious memory of all Spanish people, given the different intellectual backgrounds. And so this does not mean that the topic were completely forgotten and that the 17th and 18th century Spanish writers have completely forgotten about the Moriscos topic and gave it to, or passed down the concept to the 18th century writers. One of the Spanish writers who covered this topic in the 18th century, we can mention a manuscript by the entitled "The Mistakes of the Moriscos in Spain." It is a rare picture of this, and also Morisco Jiménez's writings about the Moriscos and the liberation of captives in Africa by Magravo, and in addition to a number of writings that were reprinted or recopied. Republishing of these writings means that the topic is still pretty much alive. The topics that were republished were not antagonistic or against the Moriscos, especially the War of Granada by Diego Anagos. This book was not against the Moriscos. So the 18th writings about the Moriscos, the 18th century writings about the Moriscos were not antagonist against the Moriscos. Then we started having writings about the Moriscos in newspapers and magazines. We conducted a research in the National Spanish Archives of the National Spanish Archives in this regard. We have seen that the topic was quite present, but at different levels, actually, and with different ratios. So the topic of the Moriscos presence has to do with the circumstances where the writers are documenting what happened and advise extensively in this regard, particularly that in this period, this was the end of the old regime in Spain and the country was facing a crisis. So the Moriscos topic was touched upon to highlight why Spanish civilization was facing major issues back then, and how reformist writers and reformist reformers were really criticizing Spanish monarchy back then and the authority of the Spanish church back then. So the topic was utilized in this context. So the most important topic in this regard is that we have seen how the Spanish writers and thinkers have been addressing this issue in the 18th century. It is the century that witnessed some sort of neutrality, because the feeling of animosity against the people, the Moriscan people, have really begun to water down and to slow down to a great extent in the 18th century. So from this perspective, we see how the context of a cultural and an economic confrontation was limited. It was not purely a cultural or religious confrontation, it was an economic confrontation as well. The old Christians were in conflict as well, an economic conflict over resources with the Moriscos. So the approach in the 18th century focused on going beyond this topic in the 18th century and the 19th century, where Spain witnessed many transformations. Despite the failure of establishing a new republic and monarchy and constitutional monarchy and many failures in this regard, there was a general trend to reduce religious control of people and individuals, the role of inspection tribunals, and the role of the church was quite limited, and the issue, we have seen more freedom of speech, and the number of newspapers increased. And here we see how historic writings about the Moriscos issue evolved, and how the Inquisition courts were completely abolished before that time. And in the 18th century and the 19th century, Moriscos issue was invoked among the liberals and the conservatives, and even the supporters of the monarchy and Republicans. And the Moriscos were likened to the Carlians who were supporting King Carl, who was demanding to be given access to the throne. However, the presence of the Moriscos in the first half of the 18th century, according to the data obtained from the newspapers and magazines, we see that there is an explosion of dealing with the Moriscos tribes, with the Moriscos issue, in the second half of the 19th century. It really received much attention. There was really quite a great deal of attention given to the Moriscos issue in the second half of the 18th, second half of the 19th century. This is the period of time where Spanish intellect started rediscovering this topic of the Moriscos. It is the time where the Spanish people recovered their memory and started discussing this topic in a very extensive manner. So if we try to pinpoint some pictures and showcase some examples in the presence of the Moriscos in some newspapers in the 18th century and the 19th century, we see what happened in the 19th century here, and how the Spanish approach of tackling the Moriscos issue shifted dramatically from what was in the 18th century. It is no longer about those who were just trying to justify the expulsion of the Moriscos and how the expulsion was justified and fair, but actually the new approach focused on considering the expulsion completely unnecessary, something that harmed Spain, and it is quite against the humanitarian values of the 19th century. Francesco Martinez de la Rosa is the first Spanish historian and expert to and playwright to reject the Spanish approach towards the Moriscos. He issued a play, or he wrote a play, which he was actually expelled to France. He was in exile in France, and his play was really played in Spain in the 1835. Then Stéphane Calderon and other writers and playwrights started focusing on the Moriscos issue, all of which were not fully supportive of the Moriscos people, but they were not against the Moriscos. A large number of those books and plays were written by Balacio from people in Valencia. So giving the how playwrights and how Spanish intellectuals tried to approach the Moriscos issue in the 19th century. We can say that those intellectuals and writers have been really highlighting and showcasing the facts associated with the tragic events that were associated with the expulsion of the Moriscos. But most writers of the 17th century completely avoided doing this. So this was also a very attractive approach for the writers of the 19th century, particularly reformist writers and intellectuals who found that defending the Moriscos will enable them to also defend human rights, such as the freedom of speech and defending human rights. So this is the issue that we have reached a conclusion with. So the strong focus on the Moriscos issue started in the 1930s or the 30s of the 19th century. This was some kind of revival of Spanish memory and revival of the topic through his extensive article about the Moriscos literature, which was written in Spanish and was translated into English in the year 1839. The Orientalist Bascuan de Gallangos was the first Spanish intellectual to write an academic study about the Moriscos in the 19th century. And even afterwards, I don't want to take up too much time, many writings after that date, many writings about the Moriscos started appearing, particularly in the 50s of the 19th century, particularly a book by Florencio Jano about the social situation of the Moriscos in Spain. So, moreover, a book about the history of the expulsion of the Moriscos in the era of Philip III, another book about the evolution of the Moriscos and the expulsion from Spain, and many other writings. In total, the main takeaway here is that the historic writings about the Spanish writers in the 19th century managed to get out from the circle of justifying the expulsion of the Moriscos and paved the way for scientific historic writing in Spain about the Moriscos, which started in the 20th century. So the academic scientific approach began to prevail with the publications of Calagrova writings and many others. So if the historic writings in Spain in the 19th century focus mainly on studying the Moriscan expulsion history, many writings in the second half of the 20th century focused about the Moriscos in exile, particularly in Morocco and Tunisia. This is as far as the topic that I've studied so far. However, the Moriscan history was not purely historical or in terms of documenting the facts. Art also approached the topic. I will quickly show you some paintings about the expulsion in the year 1613, which was published by Bancaja Group in Spain. And they were painted as part of a contest that was organized by the Spanish authorities to those who would document the expulsion of the Moriscos. Unfortunately, the winning, the painting that won the award burned down with the King's Castle in the year 1640, and we have no trace of it. This is another painting in Prado Museum in the 19th century. A number of Orientalist paintings were here. These are not Moriscans. This is a painting, yes. So we see here the Orientalist side taking the lead in this regard. This is a painting, a large painting that was present in Valencia Museum. As for the Moriscan presence in Spanish presence, now moving on to the other side, or Moriscans in the Arab thought. The Moriscan topic had a relatively important position in Spanish writings at the beginning of the modern era and the end of the modern era. It did not really receive much attention from Arab writers. I mean the Arab historians, the Moriscans themselves, and the Arab travelers who visited Spain. As we do not even find anything until the first half of the 20th century. Not a single book was dedicated to the Moriscan issue. Despite this note, we know that a number of news about the Moriscan issue began to be documented in the Islamic world, the beginning of the 16th century, in the form of secret correspondence between the Moriscans and the rulers of North Africa and a number of religious leaders, such as this message, which was sent by the Moriscans to Sultan Suleiman al-Qanuni in the year 1541. This comes from the Ottoman archives. It's a message from the Moriscans in Granada to Sultan Suleiman al-Qanuni. So Muntasir al-Gafansi Nur al-Amash in the Manaqib of al-Qashash is the first Arab book that ever covers some segments of the Moriscan history. It was issued before another book about the history of Andalusia. But we can consider that the latest text, or Al-Maqabi's book, is one of the most important texts about building the Arab narrative about the Moriscans, as most historical archives in the Arab world about this event in Arab history was focusing or based on it. However, this book by Al-Qafsi was a local book in Tunisia. So Nafhat book was divided into two major segments. The first one has 8 chapters that focus on the history of Andalusia since it was first conquered by Muslims until the expulsion of the Moriscos. The second segment has to do with the life of Digutin al-Khatbi. As for the main resources of the book, as mentioned by the author, they come from a number of books where he bought in Morocco in his youth, and what he heard or hearsay in them. The book was written in Egypt. The first topic about the Moriscan history is being very brief. From 203 pages in the 8th chapter entitled How the Enemy Defeated Muslims in Andalusia, and how the modern people there tried to ask the Muslims to assist them. It only dedicated 28 lines, to talk about the Moriscan era, which spanned more than 1 century, so since the fall of Granada until the year 1614. Despite this unbelievable brevity, Al-Maqri provided almost a complete picture of the Moriscos' history for Arab writers, whether the events taking place or those Muslims living in the Levant or away from the Morisco land, or Muslims living in Morocco close by to the Moriscos. After his book, the Moriscans started writing in the Arabic language. The main note is that the Moriscans themselves started writing in Spanish. However, they started writing after that date, and after Al-Qasbi's book, they started writing in Arabic. These were limited chapters and limited writings in conclusion of the manuscripts, such as Ibn Abd al-Rafi''s book, or just a brief mention about different topics. They would mention the Moriscos topics, such as Nasr al-Din ala Qawm al-Kafirin book. So there is no direct relationship between the texts that we have mentioned. We believe that it is the exact opposite, and that Al-Maqri's text was the first Arab text about the Moriscos' history, which was disregarded, whether before the expulsion or after it. The state of silence here is associated, as far as I believe, with the Arab historians' aversion to document how the Muslims were defeated in Spain, particularly when they highlight how the Moriscos were raped and killed when they reached the Moroccan shorelines and the Tunisian shorelines. Maybe Ibn Abd al-Rafi' was not aware of what Al-Maqri said. We know that Al-Hajri, Ahmed al-Qasim Al-Hajri, highlighted what the book said when he pointed out this topic. In the 17th and 18th century, there have been a diverse number of Arab writings which talked about the Moriscans. Almost all Moroccan travelers, including Al-Ghassani, Al-Ghazal, and Al-Miknasi, all of them pointed out in their books to some events in the Moriscos' history. And they said, they even mentioned or detailed some of the interviews with the word between brackets, the remaining Moriscans who immigrated to Arab and Muslim countries. So we see that the Moriscan history will continue to be marginalized. For Tunisia, for instance, Ibn Jannat and Al-Wazir Sarraj in the Houssem Andalusia books dedicated only a few lines to the Moriscos history and focused on how the Moriscans expelled from Spain settled in Tunisia. So the same issue was, or the same case can be applied actually to the writings of Morocco, such as Saadiya State and a book entitled Al-Hadi Akhbar Muluk al-Qarn al-Hadi, and a book entitled The History of the Indonesian Island. Some brief references to the Moriscan history, particularly talking about how the Moriscans settled in Morocco. So the narratives in the 18th and 19th century were quite similar. In Morocco, Al-Nasiri in his book Al-Istiqsa, for the information mentioned by Al-Qasri, and Ahmed ibn Ziyad in his book Ikhbar Muluk Tunis in Ahd al-Aman, what was mentioned by Ibn Abi Dinar, Al-Sarrad and Al-Naqri. With the beginning of the 20th century, the Arab writings about the Moriscos developed extensively, not just in terms of volume or the implemented scientific approaches as well, but also in terms of the terms used in those books. The modern writers use terms such as the remaining people from Andalusia, or the Andalusians, to talk about the Mauritians and their history. Since the beginning of the 20th century, they started using the term Moriscos in the Arab texts. The Lebanese writer Shakib Arslan was the first writer to use this term, or to coin this term in the Arabic language, but he defined it as, or he used it as Moriscos, the same way it is pronounced in Spanish, Moriscos. In his translation of The Last People of Sarraj, in which he added, or to which he added, a historic appendix of 27 pages about the Moriscans and the state in Granada. This is the Arab version that is more detailed, or the most detailed version of the Moriscan history back then. The first edition was in the year 1897. In addition to Arab resources, Arslan was well aware of French and Spanish writings about the Moriscan topic. Despite the fact that Arslan's book developed the Arabs' understanding of the Moriscan history and providing information that were not available in Arab books earlier, his approach and his focus on this topic remained traditional. It was based on the legend of the lost paradise. The lost history of the Moriscos is only part of what is called the legend of the fall of Andalusia. So after the publication of the novel The Last People of Sarraj, or Akhir Bani Sarraj, he published the most detailed book about them, entitled Al-Hulla Al-Sundusiyya fi al-Akhbar wal-Athar al-Andalusiyya. It is a book from 3 volumes from an encyclopedia that the author wanted to issue 10 volumes of, but the 10th volume, which was supposed to be fully dedicated to the Moriscos, was never published. But in the 3 volumes that were published, we have seen a number of references to the Moriscan history that were based mainly on Spanish resources. The writer expressed more than once about his understanding of the scarcity of knowledge in Arab resources in terms of the Moriscos history. The Arabs and the East's focus on Moriscos history increased as Muhammad Abdullah Anan, the Egyptian lawyer, wrote his book The End of Andalusia and the history of the Arabs who converted to Christianity. After the end of the first volume about the conquest of Spain, he issued the last book, his last book on this topic, about the Moriscos topic, where he declared that there is a dire need and a real need among readers to get to know this dark chapter of Muslims' history in Spain. Muhammad Abdullah Anan was the first Arab writer to write in a scientific way about the Moriscos expulsion and the history in Spain. He compared in a scientific manner the Spanish and the French resources about this topic, and he distinguished between the Andalusian and Moriscan eras in Spain, but he proposed a new term, which is the one we use today, or the Moriscos, or the Morisciyin, which, given that this term is still thorny in terms of the legitimacy of using this term or not. Is it legitimate or not? Since the 1920s, there have been an increasing number of writings in the Arab world about the Moriscos, and they can be categorized into two categories. The first category, which is more predominant and more copious, which is under the category of the epilogue of the Moriscan history, or having this sort of academic sympathy with the Moriscos. And the second category is the category that focuses on scientific approach and scientific resources. The presence of the Moriscos topic came up also on in the so-called traveling literature, and the travelers mentioned the Moriscos topic in different ways. But the presence of Andalusia in Arab novels go all the way back to the beginning of the 20th century. However, the literary coverage and the Arab plays about the Moriscos is quite recent. It goes back to the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century. As we can see here, the three books about Granada by Radu Ashur and Abdul Wahid al-Tunisi's writing about the Dome of the End of Time, and although Iron Beatrice, and there's also Egyptian focus through the last Morisco by Subhi Musa in 2015, an Egyptian writer. So there's some sort of exploding interest over the past 10 years in terms of covering the Moriscos issue in Arab literature. Moreover, there have been a main focus on the Moriscos history in the last 10 years, because there have been an increasing interest in the Arab history in terms of the Moriscos issue, given the number of articles and webinars that have been and seminars that have been dedicated to the Moriscos, and reviving the memory of the lapse of 4 centuries of the expulsion of the Moriscos from Spain. It received a massive coverage by news channels in the Arab world. Therefore, social media also played a major role in promoting the issue of the Moriscos every single year, with the we see campaigns on Facebook about the collapse of Andalusia and expulsion of the Moriscos. In 2013, there was a demonstration in Egypt to revive the fall of Andalusia in 2013. So there have been different depths of coverage in terms of the Moriscos topic, some of which focused on the tragic side of expulsion and the summarizing the entire topic in the form of the confrontation between Islam and Christianity, and how the victorious Christian majority subjugated the defeated Muslims there, and some others focused on the issue of freedom, or tackled this topic from the perspective of the rise of religious intolerance, and the people understood, the researchers started understanding that it's not just about, or it's not mainly about a religious confrontation. It is actually about a cultural confrontation, or an attempt by the majority to crush the minority culturally and at all levels. So Arab writers and travelers did not really pay much attention to the Moriscos issue until the end of the 19th century. This marginalization is based on or emanates from complete ignorance of this part of history, particularly that the Moriscans themselves documented very little of their history. We believe that given the continuous confrontation between the Spanish people and the Ottomans, the Moriscos image, with all the defeat that it represented, it was not really something that Muslim people back then wanted to get to know much about. They only focused on the flourishing of the Andalusia. So that is why the Andalusian that's why the history of the Moriscos remained almost ignored in Arab studies for several centuries. The rise in volume in terms of covering the Moriscos history did not really come with a rise in quality for the coverage. It is still part of the legend of the the fall of Andalusia, or the sad history of the fall of Andalusia, which is invoked many times to be juxtaposed with the eyes of Muslims and their civilization and Lygia, or the so-called the lost paradise, to focus on how many Arab writings actually which still want to bring images from this sad history to cascade it to the current reality. Some people say that the Moriscos issue for the Arabs has become some sort of this dark image, or as Abdulwahid Khmir, the Moroccan writer, said, it is a form of the end of history for the Arabs. The same topic was written by Adonis in two poems in which he said, you don't love the night of this of what is gone, because you are focusing on the morning of the future that will come. So he wants to conclude by a positive note. He says that the evening will really pave the way for the rising sun with sunrise. So if we can take it from this perspective as the darkness before the night, to consider it some sort of sunrise before sunset. Thank you for your listening and attention. Thank you for listening.